welcome once again to Worldviews in Church History. I'm your host, Kent Powderly, and we reached week 19, where we're going to be connecting the Reformation era to the modern political world. We have a guest, Pastor Robert Hall, Pastor Emeritus of Calvary Rio Rancho. He's been my pastor for really about half my life, and he's had to put up with me, well, for half my life.
We put up with each other.
Yeah. Well, it worked out well. Anyway, why don't we start with a word of prayer? Lord, thank you for this time. Father, thank you for your word. And Father, thank you for how richly it has affected our history. Please help to restore to our people, especially to Christians, a love and a respect for our history, as it is something that is being robbed from us today. We pray that you'd use this mightily in Jesus' name. Oh yes, Lord, and please keep the bugs away. Amen. Anyway, now we're going to go back just a little bit briefly to Calvinist Geneva. And we mentioned earlier, a couple weeks back, how Calvinist Geneva was a form of a sort of a Reformation safe house for Europe. You know, where all of these reformers in various different parts of Europe, they would escape the persecution in their home countries, and they could hole up in Geneva there and actually get an education at the Geneva Academy that John Calvin founded. Now, a case in point of that is the Scotch reformer, John Knox. And Knox, there's a picture of him here. He served the Protestant English boy king that we talked about, Edward VI, as his personal chaplain. He had to flee to Geneva when the Catholic Mary Tudor became queen when Edward died of tuberculosis, if you'll recall. And there he was educated in Calvinism and returned to England after the death of Bloody Mary and the rise of Queen Elizabeth I. And he was also the founder of the Scotch Presbyterian Church. And Pastor Robert has done quite a bit of study on John Knox, and so I'm going to turn things over to him for just a little bit here. He's got some really interesting slides that he's showed us. He took a trip, he and his lovely wife, to Scotland, and I'm going to let you take this.
That was very eye-opening. Time in Scotland. It was with Landmark Tours, which I would recommend to all of you if you get a chance. It's a 2-week tour starting in Edinburgh and going really through, led by a church historian and a church architect. So it was both believers, and it was quite a trip. I want to start in the island of Iona, which is out toward on the coast, separated from the Scottish mainland. And it's from this place that Columba, which I think Kent has talked about, Columba came to Scotland to evangelize, and he ended up setting up this church and a monastery here. And I want to show you this graveyard. That's my lovely bride in the graveyard. I was amazed to find out that this graveyard contains the graves of kings and queens from all over Europe, Christians who asked to be buried here in this churchyard in Iona. And the reason was because they knew Columba was buried here, and they wanted to be buried with him so that in the last day they could rise with him. So just to see how famous this man was, and it's amazing to walk around these old markers and see the names of kings from Norway and Sweden and Germany and all over the place. This is really where Christianity started in Scotland. And Christianity, when it was in Scotland at the beginning, was not Catholicism. It was not Catholicism as Kent has talked to you about with the Pope at the head and so forth. It was more like modern Christianity. The pastors were married.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting revival there. And later in history of Scotland, they were forced into the Catholic Church. And that, of course, is a lot of what we're going to talk about today, is the struggle between Catholicism and Presbyterianism in the nation of Scotland. And one of the separations, it's not complete, but is Highland and Lowlands. And you'll hear all about that in history as you go along. But there were Highlanders descended from the Picts and so forth, although most people in Scotland came through Ireland at the beginning. They were Gaelic people that ended up in Scotland.
Some from Wales. We had actually talked about the distinction between the Celtic Church and the Roman mission that started.
It's really evident here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, that was all I wanted to say.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about the next. Then we were in Edinburgh. We actually saw the castle in Edinburgh, and if you read, we don't want to spend a lot of time there, but if you want to read about some very interesting just political history as well as religious, that's an interesting spot. We were able to see that. Go ahead. And this is the Holyrood, which is the residence of Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary of Guise before her, and obviously James after James I became the king. And this castle is interesting because there's one main road all the way through Old Town Edinburgh, and this castle's at one end. The castle's at one end, and then down below is the Holyrood church, the courtyard, the palace for the king. And John Knox lived on that street, which I found very interesting. But
let me ask you something real quick. I know that a rood, there used to be under the Catholic worship a thing called the rood screen.
Yeah.
And the Catholics don't do this anymore, but back in that day, they would have what's called a rood screen, and it would actually hide the priest when he did the transubstantiation thing. And so the Holy Rood, for some reason, I think the rood was the word for that whole process of doing that.
That was one thing we found out, and I'll show you some other slides, but when the Protestants took over, John Knox's Reformation took over and Protestants became into power, they began to design churches for the Protestant faith. Not churches that were Catholic at the beginning, that had the separation of the altar and so forth, where normal everyday people were not allowed up front of the church. Their churches were more in the round, more like you have today, where the congregation has access to pastors essentially on the same level, although he may have to be up a little bit to be seen. But you'll see this is one of their national symbols, which I can never figure out the unicorn, where that came from. That's not out of the Bible, but...
Well, actually, it does in the Old King James and the Geneva Bible. It does mention the unicorn.
Oh, it actually mentions it.
Yeah. And that's a Holyrood Castle, or a wall of it. And
this is St. Giles Church. This is where a kirk, they call it in Scotland. This is where John Knox preached at times when he wasn't at St. Andrews. So this was again a Catholic church, designed as a Catholic church architecturally, and then taken over later by the Protestants. Go ahead. And that's the top of the church. When we were in Edinburgh, we went to the Museum of Scotland, and that's where I began to see. Amazingly, I'm glad we took a couple extra days, and actually at the beginning, before the tour, we went to that museum, and I could not believe all of the inventions that came out of Scotland. I didn't understand at the time why there were so many engineers, so many inventors, so many scientists that were, and even people in politics, people who studied things that we take for granted today, really came out of the Scottish Reformation, and we're going to explain that in a bit. The bicycle was one of the ones that got me.
Oh yeah, well yeah, you You were famous for two things: the Death March and the cross country. And by cross country, I'm talking about like maybe cross the whole United States almost.
Yeah, we did 1,000 miles.
Well, 1,000 miles, yeah, close enough.
Yeah, close enough. But I came across this book, which I highly recommend to read. I don't agree with everything in the book theologically, but this is an amazing book on the effect of the Reformation in Scotland. We're going to explain that in a bit, and how that changed Scotland and ultimately changed Britain and ultimately changed Europe and ultimately then was the seeds of the American Revolution, that all men are created equal and so forth. That the Scots had an amazing effect on the rest of the world, and there's a secret to that. And I'm not going to tell you yet till we go into it.
Yeah. But one thing amazing about the whole idea of all men are created equal, people today they don't really understand what that means. It's not saying that all men are created equal in their talents and everything. It's all men are created equal under the law, under God.
Excellent.
And that's what that's talking about. Anyway.
Well, here's one of the churches we were in.
Yeah, that's
not my dream pulpit, but was amazing to me that this was a church in the round on two different levels. The reason the pulpit had to be so high was because they wanted the pastor to look straight into the eyes of the people on the second level. Now, I do want to say one thing. It's interesting to me. I don't know how many of you have watched some of the Jane Austen, BBC period dramas from the 1800s, and one thing that strikes you is that you have an upper class and then an upper class above that, an upper class above that, but then they're completely separated from normal everyday people. That was beginning to be broken down in the Reformation in Scotland, but not entirely. In this church you're seeing right here was designed from the ground up as a Presbyterian church, Protestant church. But in that church, there was a box for the local Lord's family. It was on the same level with everybody else, but it was their private seating area.
So it was sort of like a modern Super Bowl football stadium that way.
Yeah, it was exactly. And I was like, well, what's that doing here? And he said, well, he's the local Lord, and his family sat in that special box, even though it was all men are created equal. So even in I've noticed, and I'm sure you have too, that these people who start things in church history, the people who started, often aren't able to get too far from what they were brought up with.
Yeah, we've mentioned that.
They can only go so far.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting that I said, well, whose box is that? They said, oh, that's the local Laird's box.
Well, yeah, we've talked about that. I mean, with the whole the sola scriptura, the scripture first as the authority in the church. Well, yeah, the idea was put forth originally by Origen in the 3rd century, but it became the thing under Martin Luther. But not everything that Luther believed survived that sola scriptura as it was applied over time.
Right.
And these things are like aircraft carriers; they don't turn on a dime.
Yeah.
And this is the same thing with slavery too.
We went to St. Andrews. I just wanted to show you this is the ruins of the St. Andrews Cathedral, which was Catholic. In fact, John Knox was trained as a Catholic priest, and he taught here. This is kind of where he sparked the sort of the Reformation revolution, as if I can say that, in the town of St. Andrews. St. Andrews is also where, I don't know if you need to remember these people, but there are two men, Patrick Hamilton and George Wishart. Both of those men were very instrumental in St. Andrews at training John Knox. They were both martyred in St. Andrews. We actually saw the places where they had marked their graves and where they were martyred. And Wishart really trained under Calvin and brought Reformation. And in fact, John Knox, as we'll talk about in a bit, was actually his bodyguard at one point, carrying a sword and walking around with Wishart, protecting him as he preached. But when it came time for him to be martyred, he sent John Knox away, believing that Knox had much more to do, and he didn't want Knox to die with him. So it's very interesting.
He was right about that, eh?
Yeah. And John Knox is the guy really that Kent brought up. Uh, Amazing how much he went through being trained at times in Geneva and then as the court pastor really for England for a number of years, and all the things he went through to finally have the truth of sola scriptura dawn on him, that he began to preach not sermons from Daniel against the Pope, but actually began to preach biblical truth. And they said that once he really got a hold of this biblical truth and was spent his time in Geneva, which I think you're going to talk about, he began to really present the message of the gospel. George Wishart, the martyr, actually was responsible for bringing John Knox to Jesus. His conversion experience was in his relationship with Wishart. So, and from here, Kent's the expert on this, but it was amazing to see these places and to hear these men's stories in Scotland on site. I tell you what, it's worth all the money that it cost to go there. It really was.
And what was the effect of Knox's work in the realm of just general education, period?
Well, when Knox went to Geneva, Knox saw in Geneva a city with a plan, and that plan came out of John Calvin's mind, Jean Calvin or whatever, but John Calvin.
Jean Calvin.
Calvin, yeah, but that came out of his mind. He wanted to have a city-state that was Christian from the government down to the people. And I don't mean a church-controlled state, but a state in which Christians and the Christian ideals controlled the state and worked with the church. And so he had this small city-state there that was a Christian vision. And when Knox saw this, he said, dude, we need this for Scotland, for the whole country. So his very vision was, as I can say this, probably not doable in his own lifetime, because he wanted to have a whole country, a third of which or more was staunch Catholics, and he wanted to bring them under what we would call a Presbyterian or a Protestant government, church government, and so forth. And so that actually was not accomplished during his lifetime. It was 30 years after he died that they actually put his vision into complete practice. But getting to what you asked me, one thing he saw in Geneva was education for everybody. Mm-hmm. And this is one thing we saw, Juanita and I saw in England, which is absolutely amazing, is that Scotland left England in the dark educationally. And when I started looking into it, I realized, well, if you watch the BBC productions and everything, you'll see that the normal everyday people, the plowman, the baker, those kind of people, they weren't denied education. They weren't given any education. You learn to be a baker, you learn to be a baker. Well, John Knox came back and he started this vision in Scotland where every child would go through grade school. Every child would learn to read. Every child would learn to read from the Bible. Mm-hmm. Every child would learn Christian faith and Christian truth from the beginning. And so what he did is essentially cast a vision to educate the entire country. And one thing, again, going around there, you see the bicycle invented. You see the iron plow. You see stuff that the Scots invented. Why? Because they were educating every man, woman, and child. Mm-hmm. And the rich people paid for their own education. The church paid for the education of the poor. Mm-hmm. While England was denying 2/3, 3/4 of their population education, mm-hmm. Scotland was educating everybody. And so when you say names like Dale Carnegie, you say, different famous Scots that came out of that, mm-hmm. that was because his vision was a Christian education.
Yeah, we had mentioned in the wake of Bible translation, in a very general sort of way, how that was what spawned and motivated the whole idea of universal literacy. Knox basically put the shoe leather to the road there in bringing it out in detail, and you can see this outworking. Knox was alive during the Elizabethan era, where a lot of the Tudor reforms did come in, but he actually pushed things farther in Scotland than they went in England.
Yeah, he wrote two things when he returned from Geneva the second time. One of them is the Presbyterian Confession, which is still today. You can look it up online. It's most of us would agree with that confession. And then he wrote this thing called the Book of Discipline, and this was his vision for a country where all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That was his vision. Well, the Parliament, made up of lords and lairds, looked at that and said, well, wait a minute, you're going to say that the people have authority, not us. And so the leaders at the time rejected his vision for the entire country. They did put the education into place. But Knox basically said nobody's above the law. Even the ruler has to abide by the law. And one thing, one idea of his that is in this country, and think clearly with me here, is that in old England or any of those old European countries, authority rested with a man or with a woman, whoever was in power. Knox's vision was authority rests with the office, not the person. So the President of the United States has authority while he's in office, but like right now, Donald Trump has no authority. He's just a former president. Why? Because the authority rests in the office. This is Knox's vision. And once the upper class saw that, they said, "Oh no, you can't do that, because that will cut us out."
Would if he could see Biden today, would he be going, "Oh"?
Oh no!
I'm just kidding.
He really brought in Lex Rex, which is one of the things that founded our country. But in a sense, the people rule. The voice of a Christian people, literate Christian people, should be the bedrock of a government. And when you take that away, when you turn your back on Christianity, when you turn your back on education, as we have done in this country today, ruin is the only ultimate result. Because and Knox saw this, and so he basically brought in universal education, and of course it's more complicated than that. He had his struggles with Mary, Queen of Scots, and so forth. I think I have a picture here of his house that I was in Edinburgh, which I thought was pretty funny because it's like halfway between the castle and Mary, Queen of Scots house. And listen, by the way, if you've seen the movie with Katharine Hepburn, don't believe a word of it. That's not the way it happened.
Well, the whole Mary, Queen of Scots thing, I know the Monty Python skit on it. You are Mary, Queen of Scots? I am. And then they start beating her up. And then one of them says, I think she's dead. And she goes, no, I'm not. And then they start beating her up again, and that's the end of the play.
Well, this is an interesting thing that we all should know, is that the English, during the American Revolution, called our revolution the Presbyterian Revolution. I just want you guys to understand it. And that is because so many Scots, so much of the influence of Scotland was on our country that they saw all the pastors, the ministers that were preaching in the United States, most of them were from Scotland. Benjamin Rush, a Scot. I mean, when you read that book, How the Scots Have Been in the Modern World, you see how so many of our founding fathers were born in Scotland, or born from
John Witherspoon, another one.
From Scotland.
Going back here real quick, you'll notice on the pulpit there, you have that Presbyterianism in the architecture. You'll notice down below there you have several seats that were the elders or the presbyters. And then up atop you would have the preacher or the pastor. Not so much to elevate the pastor, but more or less so that people could hear him. But it also elevated the Word of God, the preaching of the Word of God. That was the core of that whole.
It wasn't the man; it was the Word of God.
Right.
And I do need to say the reason that pulpit is so high is only because it was level with the second level of seating. They wanted the pastor to look into the eyes of the people, but it was almost in the round. So it was just a different vision than a Catholic church, and you can just tell for the architecture. Now, out of this, Mary, Queen of Scots, of course, came her infant son, who she was a dying-to-wool Catholic, but her son was actually James, where we get our King James Bible.
That's right.
Which I'm sure you've
James,
talked about.
yeah, we've talked about James some. We talked about how the King James Bible really originated. It was a compromise that King James. Now, King James was a Roman Catholic who was educated, at least mostly by Protestant, if not all the way by Protestantism.
Well, that's because he was in Scotland. He had to toe the mark.
Exactly.
Scotland was Protestant.
Yeah, Scotland.
Although there were a number of Catholics, we'll see.
Yeah.
In 17.
Well, when he was a kid, they were Catholics, but by the time he was growing up, they were Protestant.
Oh yeah. He had no choice.
He was the first of the Stuart dynasty.
Right.
He took over because Elizabeth I, last of the Tudor dynasty, she died childless, and so he comes to the English throne after Queen Elizabeth. We covered that. It was the son of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, and we covered that.
Let me
go ahead.
Dig in. Her mother was Mary of Guise, and I'm not saying that right, but she was French, and she sent her daughter back to France. But that Mary of Guise is really the one who was most against Protestantism and had the most power and caused a battle between Catholics and Protestants and caused John Knox to flee Scotland and everything else. She was really, I don't want to say one of the wicked few, but she was one of the.
I don't know what it was with the Marys, except for the last one we're going to talk about, the Marys.
Yeah.
Mary Tudor, Mary Guise, Mary Queen of Scots. They had a.
Mary of Guise was a real problem for John Knox and for the Protestants. Mary Queen of Scots was handled very well by the Protestants. She never had the power her mother did.
Well, up until the point when Philip II of Spain tried to engineer her rise to the throne, and Queen Elizabeth had to have her executed, basically. Yeah. But of herself, she probably wouldn't have gone there. So King James I, he's a Roman Catholic with mostly Protestant education, at least, if not all. And again, we got the King James Bible because he negotiated with the Puritans. He didn't want the Geneva Bible because it had all of these Presbyterian study notes in it. And his famous political axiom, we mentioned before, was no bishop, no king. You get rid of an episcopal. See, in this day and age, secular government often imitated church government. So he saw the whole thing of, well, you get rid of a bishop-run church, an episcopal church. Well, what's next? Getting rid of the king.
Well,
and
also,
so
he wanted to use the church to keep himself in power.
Of course he did.
He didn't want to change the Anglican Church.
Right.
He wanted to keep it there as a structure to control the people.
Right. So he, knowing that he wasn't going to be able to make England Catholic again, he chose that form of Protestantism that was most like Roman Catholicism, which was the High Church Episcopalian model. Now, this kind of, for a while, left Knox's Scottish Presbyterianism out in the cold where the monarchy was concerned, but and especially once his son, Charles I, took over.
Scotland felt robbed because James was their king, and they liked him, and he never went back to Scotland. He went to London and became king of the British, the British Isles, we call them, but he never went back to Scotland. They really felt cheated out of that. And he turned, honestly, on the Presbyterians. And so that they were pretty much not happy with him being the king of everything.
Yeah, and they were even less happy with Charles I,
his son,
because he followed his father's maxim of the whole no bishop, no king. Only Charles I didn't have the wisdom that James I had. James I had enough wisdom to negotiate settlements of things if he could, which the whole King James Bible thing was a good example, because basically he said, okay, you can have your authorized translation, get rid of all the Presbyterian study notes. You have your text, and that was really the main thing, was they wanted to have an authorized Bible text.
This guy was worse because he worked with William Laud, who was in the Anglican Church, to push the Book of Common Prayer, which was essentially, in all respects except a few, Catholic, and he tried to force the people of Scotland to use the Book of Common Prayer in their Presbyterian churches, and big mistake.
He carried that whole no bishop, no king out with a particular paranoia that really his father had enough wisdom to avoid.
So I don't know for a fact, but I was told in the history that a third of the Scottish ministers walked out of the churches in Scotland. They refused to use the Book of Common Prayer, which essentially, and this is a difference today, it actually told you what you could say and what you could pray during a church service. And essentially it was Anglican. So it was Episcopalian. And so you take that and try to impose it upon Presbyterian churches, you got a problem.
Well, that's not going to fly, is it?
Yeah.
James had believed in the divine prerogative of the king as an absolute monarch. Like I said, he negotiated with the Puritans. But Charles, on the other hand, he held that as absolute monarch, he owed no explanation to anyone except God for his actions and his policies. And you mentioned some of those were just not good.
Completely went to his head.
Yes, absolutely. The whole absolute power corrupts absolutely thing.
It went to his head and he lost his head.
Yes, exactly. The Protestant subjects objected to his marriage to a French Catholic princess because they didn't want a whole new dynasty of Catholic monarchs there. I mean, they were willing to tolerate these guys a little bit as long as they kept their Catholicism private. But of course, Charles was really not willing to do that so much. And so Parliament did not go along with Charles' absolute monarchy by divine right, and civil war broke out. In fact, a series of them broke out. And after the second of 3 civil wars, Charles fell into the hands of the parliamentary military forces. And as you just said, off with his head.
Yeah.
And remember, we mentioned the whole battle axe thing? It wasn't as neat as that picture. Those battle axes, they had to take a bunch of different chops a lot of times.
Yeah, you had to pay your executioner to sharpen his axe and get a good cut. That was the whole deal.
Yes.
All you got to do is follow the money.
Yeah, yeah, the golden rule. Whoever has the gold rules.
Yeah.
And Charles I is tried for treason and beheaded by an act of Parliament in 1649. And the Puritan parliamentary soldier who was in charge of the army, Oliver Cromwell, became the Lord Protector of a British Republic that lasted 5 years. And even though he did really horrible things to Ireland, he did do a couple of things right.
It should be stated, when you think about the English, you can't think of them as Americans. You can't say to yourself, we feel about Oliver Cromwell as if they felt about Oliver Cromwell as we would a champion. They were very upset that the king has had his head cut off.
Oh yeah,
that was not a consensus of the people of England.
Yeah,
and the people of England overall were comfortable as they are today with the royals.
Mm-hmm.
They really wanted the monarch.
Yeah, they just wanted them to not be quite so overbearing.
Yeah, I mean, Cromwell did some good things, which we're going to talk about, but overall he was not. It was not liked by the English people, and so they were ready to welcome back that family at some point, or somebody as monarchs.
And that's exactly what we'll see. Cromwell's army consisted of a lot of nonconformists, the Baptist nonconformists,
separate
to Anglicanism, right? And the separatists. The separatists were the Puritans who said, Anglicanism is a lost cause. We're going to separate from that. Right. Now, only some of the Puritans went the separatist route. Others stayed within the Church of England, and it could be said positively of the separatists and the ones that stayed. They had a denominational approach to it. They weren't sectarian. In fact, the Pilgrims, we're going to see, were a combination of separatists and non-separatists that came in, and a very interesting story. We'll get to that next week. But anyway, he had an army of nonconformist Baptist Congregationalists and other separatists. And they'd fought for the Parliament, but now the Parliament was looking like they were going to just put Presbyterianism as the next state church. And what have we been talking about? every problem can be traced back to Christendom. That whole combination of Christianity and kingdom. And they were about to do the same thing with Presbyterianism.
Yeah, let me interject too. Looking back historically, Calvin's Christianity in Geneva was quite oppressive. If you weren't a Christian, in fact, he had a lot of struggles with people in Geneva not wanting to do that. But they would, if you didn't go to church, you were fined. If they caught you doing something that was against church government, you were banished from Geneva. And later, you could almost lose your life for doing something like that. It was very oppressive.
Well, yeah, we covered the Servetus affair, Michael Servetus.
Right. Well, Knox's vision for Scotland was also, in some sense, oppressive if it had all been instituted. So, to me, and what I like about Cromwell, it's impossible to force oppressive Christian doctrine. We don't smoke. We don't
even if
chew.
it's the right doctrine.
Yeah. Well, even though, but I'm thinking of we don't smoke, we don't chew, we don't go with girls that do. You know, when you start adding rules in your faith and you start forcing everyone, even in the New World, at the Mayflower, to try and force people to act Christian, it becomes oppressive.
Oh yeah, and we're going to talk about that next week or the week after. It will either be next week or the week after.
You just can't do that. It has to be from the heart, or it's not going to work. And
that's right.
Even Cromwell trying to do what he did.
They did not. Like I say, this whole idea was slow in coming. I mean, you're dealing with 1,000 years of church history that has been really according to that Christendom model. You don't turn around from that overnight. You know, eventually the Sola Scriptura, people kind of reason, oh my gosh, so though there was unprecedented religious and intellectual freedom under Cromwell, his secretary is an interesting guy. His name was John Milton, and he was a very famous poet and political commentator, but he's most well known as being the author of Paradise Lost. And this was a Puritan masterpiece. It was sort of somewhere in the zone between a long epic poem and a novel. And Mr. Milton, he said, the end of all learning is to know God, and out of that knowledge, to love and imitate him. And in Paradise Lost, the epic poem became notable in that it presented Satan as a real person. And, you know, people were kind of wigged out by that, because Satan was usually just, you know, he was this sort of canard for everything bad. But that he's a real person, though, is biblical. And these are some of Satan's statements made in Paradise Lost. He said, and out of good, still to find means of evil. And farewell remorse, all good to me is lost. Evil, be thou my good. That was Satan in Paradise Lost, book 1 there. But in treating Satan this way, Milton portrayed him as the quintessential revolutionary legend in his own mind. So even though he was part of a revolutionary process, he saw where the danger points were, and he saw where that could go, you know, rather than being just a foil for all evil, Milton depicted Satan as somebody who believed himself morally justified in his rebellion. And nobody...
Tongue-in-cheek commentary on what was going on in England.
Exactly. He said the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. And very interesting. Of course, this was simply the depiction of the tyrant's delusion, not covert anti-Puritanism. I sat in a college class my daughter was in when she was at UNM, and they were doing Paradise Lost, and I had coincidentally, not really, had just read Paradise Lost. And one of the things that the TA was trying to bring out was, well, they say that Milton was really not a Puritan, and that he was sort of slipping subversive stuff. I'm going, no. I said, well, wait a minute. Wouldn't that all be more easily explained by the fact that Milton was carrying his Puritanism to its logical conclusion? Because in the Bible, Satan is a person. He's a person. He's not just a symbol. And so Milton, treating him like a person, invests him with the attitude of the ultimate tyrant. And tyrants always believe they're doing the right thing, or they're doing what they're doing for a good cause. And so this modern approach to Milton is, it's not very well thought out, among other things.
Well, the whole thing with Oliver Cromwell points out to us this: no one man can do what's right.
Yeah.
Forever.
Yeah.
And he had good and bad things about him, and he made some terrible mistakes. But the point is, there's no one man that's infallible. And it came to a bad end. And the English people didn't like having Protestantism forced down their throats, and so what did they want? They wanted their king back.
Yep.
And the end, it didn't
and
bring,
and in the end,
order.
Cromwell's republic wasn't able to bring order because of this. And the army sacked his son and successor, Richard.
Wasn't the same man.
Yeah, no, and he wasn't nearly as good a leader. And representatives at this point, after they sack Richard, after Oliver dies, they go to Charles the First's son, Charles the Second, in France. Yeah, he's hiding in France there, and they asked him to return as the monarch that he would have been anyway if it had not been for Cromwell.
Right.
And so it was almost like, well, that was a bunch of wasted time.
Yeah, he was a partier, though. He
was called the Merry Monarch, and this is why he was so popular. He kept for the most part, he kept his hands out. He was like a lot of the modern constitutional monarchs. He kept out of the politics of it a lot, and he was just interested in partying and showing everybody a good time. And
I don't want to be crude, but he was souse most of the time.
Yes, he was. He spent a good deal of his time rather souse. They called him the Merry Monarch. He did reestablish some of his father's policies, but he was less political and a little more easygoing. He died without children, however, which left his solidly Roman Catholic brother James II in line for the throne. And this is going to be a problem because unlike James I, James II is not really educated Protestant. He is ideologically full-on Roman Catholic. Yeah. And so he fully reestablishes an absolute monarchy after the Charles I model.
Tries.
Yeah, he tries.
He was not well liked, that guy.
No, he was not at all well liked. At first, the mostly Protestant Parliament tolerated his personal Catholicism because they figure, well, maybe he'll be like Charlie, the second. But he wasn't. And when his son, James Francis Edward, was born, James II cut his Protestant daughter, his oldest daughter, Mary, out of the line of succession.
This is the good Mary.
Yeah, she was the good Mary.
Yeah,
the good Mary. Yeah, all of the Marys up until now, for the last 100 or so years, not been good. This Mary was good, so he cuts her out. Now the Presbyterian Scots and even the Episcopalian Parliament refused to accept this edict, his edicts, any longer. So this sets into motion a series of events that history calls the Glorious Revolution.
So let me interject.
Mm-hmm.
If you ever hear of the Scots Covenanters, this is where this movement came to rise, is that they refused to go back to Catholicism, and it was being pushed on them, and so they signed a covenant, essentially, that said, the Bible, Jesus, or die.
Yep.
And that was it. And some of this time, somebody say as high as 18,000 Scots suffered martyrdom. I don't know if that's completely true, but there was a terrible time of persecution during James.
Certainly, a lot of them did. Yeah. So and the Scotch
Covenanters. That's
the Covenanters.
Covenanters.
The Scotch Presbyterians and the Parliament. They both feared that James II would, in the wake of this, of course, engineer the return to an ideologically Roman Catholic monarchy like that of Mary Tudor's. Yeah, eventually, if he'd been allowed to. So this brought things once again to the brink of another civil war that really would have been much more bloodier than the others. Parliament appealed to the Protestant daughter of James II, Mary, to marry the Dutch Protestant monarch William III of Orange. And when James II saw the uprising that was coming against him from virtually every quarter, he fled to France. And Parliament then charged him with desertion. And
that's very convenient.
Yes, it was. A further act of Parliament placed William and Mary on the throne as co-monarchs, and that's why you had this college in Virginia that Thomas Jefferson went to. It was the College of William and Mary. It was named after these guys.
They were actually pretty good.
They were. They were put in on the throne as co-monarchs, but not without a new thing, and that was a Bill of Rights. They were their rise to power was almost bloodless, and this is why it was called the Glorious Revolution. It was the triumph of this starting with Knox, Presbyterian, but also the separatists too, and this was bloodless, and because William and Mary became co-monarchs by an act of Parliament with a Bill of Rights and increased parliamentary powers, the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and Wales too, became the first major constitutional monarchy. And the king was no longer the absolute to create law and wage war. He became the first citizen under the law, as you mentioned. So you see Knox's ideas, even though they didn't happen in his lifetime, they are unfolding as these ideas are working their way out, sometimes in spite of people, sometimes in spite of the people and the rulers. And the idea of unalienable rights comes largely from this Scottish Presbyterian understanding of human depravity. And so this brings us back to the theology of the Reformation, and the theology really that preceded the Reformation, where man is a sinner, he has a sin nature. Nobody can be trusted with too much power because all men are sinners.
They even got that right in the first movie, Superman, with Gene Hackman, when he said, "My daddy always says people are no darn good."
Yeah. So the tendency of too much power in one man was repaired, at least in part, by establishing a separation of powers. This is where the whole idea of separation of powers came from, between a monarchy, prime minister, the parliament, and the courts. The courts came into that a little bit later.
And really came out of Scotland.
Yes.
Onto the UK.
Yes. It was there. There's a vision of Knox, and we're going to see that put into play by a couple of figures. One is a continuation of the Scottish Presbyterianism, and then we'll come to the second one. And this all came indirectly from the teachings of John Knox, built upon by theological and later political theorists of the day. Now, this is sort of a map of the whole absolute monarchy type system. You see everything bounces off the monarch there.
The king is above the law.
Yeah.
So he can do whatever he wants to you.
He is the
law.
Anybody
else, because God made him king, and there's no law that can touch him.
That's right. And that was the ruler by a royal family by divine right. It was pretty much the prototype of that was Charlemagne, and we covered all of that.
That's one reason he didn't like the Geneva Bible, because it didn't give credence to divine right of kings.
That's right.
The Geneva Bible was, and that's what rubbed him wrong. That's
right.
One thing, we never talk about this, but very clearly in the King James Bible, they stayed away from any attack on the monarchy. In the wording, they had to be very careful, because James had to pass that Bible as he would approve of that, and he did not approve of lex rex, which is that the king is under the law.
Right.
The law reigns, and the king is under the law.
But anyway, if you want to pause it here and look at this chart, certainly be a good idea to do that. And also this chart here, because it's a parliamentary monarchy in the United Kingdom as it came to be today, and even before that. Now, of course, as we've often seen,
this is the sad part.
Yeah, as we've often seen, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and that little resurgence under Justinian, there is a last desperate backlash from any system that's falling. And one of the things that I think we really need to be aware of today is that we not fall in to this pattern of the last desperate backlash, because the desperate backlash never restores the good things that were lost. It only hastens the downfall. Yeah. And the Catholic Scots under Bonnie Prince Charlie, not to be confused with Charles I or Charles II.
So let me tell you, the French wanted to take over Scotland to harass the British, and so the French told Bonnie Prince Charlie, he's called, right? He is actually Charles II's son.
Yeah, well, James, he's James the...
he's James's son.
Yeah, James II through James Francis Edward, the baby. Right. When James tried to cut Mary out of the line of succession, he was going to put it through James Francis Edward. Bonnie Prince Charlie is the descendant, or either the son of James Francis Edward.
Yeah, this guy was snotty, and he thought he owned the world. And he went to the French king and said, "If you'll give me thousands of troops, I will land in Scotland, and the Scots will follow me." Well, there was a large contingent of Highlander Christians, Catholics, who would follow him. Well, through a series of events, God did not allow. First of all, the ships were wrecked. He landed in Scotland with a few people, and he then rallied the Highlander Catholics to him. So this was a Catholic war against the now King George in the south, who was Protestant, and Hanover, and he rallied the Catholics. And so this was essentially a Catholic uprising against the Protestant King George.
Now this is the same King George of American Revolution fame, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
And it was not pretty.
No.
Bonnie Prince Charlie was if I can say this, was an idiot on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't listen to his generals, and he ended up causing thousands of Highlanders and some Lowlander Catholics to be slaughtered on the battlefield and after the battlefield. This was not a pretty, it was not glorious. He was not Bonnie. It was not really not pretty.
And this is the problem whenever we see these backlashes of a falling order. And the sad truth is, even the fall of a good order will do this.
He lied.
Not that was a good order, but
he lied to the Highland Lords, the Highland Lords that brought their tenant farmers. They didn't really have any clans anymore. They brought their tenant farmers with them, and it was just they faced English cannons with grape shot and accurate rifling and so forth, the same kind of stuff that was in the American Revolution that we had to face. But these people were not ready for the battle, and they charged headlong into just
this
death.
Culminated with the Battle of Culloden, which is what these pictures are of here.
There was a rumor that the Scots had butchered some English prisoners, and they can't prove that was true. But after the battle, the English left Battle of Culloden. The English left the wounded on the battlefield for 3 days without water, and then they went through systematically and bayoneted anybody who was alive. So it was very very disgusting. Then they began killing anybody in Scotland they ran into. Let me tell you about this, Kent. This is very interesting. We went to this church. It's the Old High Church in Inverness, and if you'll notice this graveyard, there are in the graveyard, they will point out to you the gravestone where the people that were executing all of the Catholics after that battle. Anybody they thought was even connected. They executed so many innocent people, but they brought them to this graveyard, and they had a gravestone where they rested their rifles on, and they had another gravestone where they stood the prisoners up, and they shot them. Well, it was going on so hot and furious that if you'll notice across the waterway there on the other side, you'll see those houses. To this day, there are bullet holes that have been left in those houses where the Georgia's troops missed the person they were shooting a few yards away in the graveyard, and the bullet went across the street and landed in the. There was a lady that lived over there, and she kept complaining because the bullets were hitting her house. They were executing so many people.
Oh.
But it was a very sad time for Scotland,
yeah.
and they made kilts illegal. They were not allowed to carry the. I can't think of the name, but the cudgels they used to carry.
I don't remember what they're called.
And it was a very sad time, and it was he was at fault, and he fled. He was hid in Scotland for years before he could get out of Scotland. He had different people, and it was the death penalty to harbor him. But this one famous family harbored him. I forget their names, but they ended up moving to the United States or to the colonies, and then they went through the Revolutionary War. But she had actually harbored him for a while, and finally he got out and went back to France and died a bitter, bitter man. I think in Italy.
He was born in Italy.
Yeah, he was drunk as his grandfather.
Yeah.
They were.
Yeah.
Not a good bunch, but that was actually. If you ever wonder how we got German kings in England, that's how. Because when William and Mary. After William and Mary, they said, well, we need to call a king now out of that line, and the distant cousin was a Hanover, in Germany, and so they called it, and that's how Queen Elizabeth we have now, she's actually a descendant of German royalty.
Yeah, and that's why during World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm and the Queen Elizabeth's granddaughter.
Yeah,
they were all interbred with it. Yeah,
Victoria. They were
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but this was the backlash. It was bloody, but it didn't last long because the theological theory behind Knox's view of polity, authority, was laid out by Scottish Presbyterian just not long before this. A Scottish Presbyterian pastor by the name of Samuel Rutherford, and his book Lex Rex, Law is King, came out in 1644. He was maybe a generation or two after Knox, but he took a lot of Knox's ideas and he formed a coherent political theory around them. And I like this quote of Samuel Rutherford, if only because I've heard you preach on this very thing for about half my life. And he says, believe God's word and power more than you believe your own feelings and experience. Your rock is Christ, and it is not the rock which ebbs and flows, but your sea.
Yeah.
So this was very canny. Rutherford was, like I said, just a couple of generations removed, and this is the title page of Lex Rex. They had huge titles in those days because they didn't have to compete with films and make things all brief and everything. Knox's teaching was foundational to Rutherford, and Rutherford made the first comprehensive political application of Knox and Calvin to the English world. But by this time, the utopian elements of the Geneva experiment were worked out, and even Knox's harder edges had been rubbed off somewhat, enough that this was how political liberty began in Britain.
Yeah, I do want to say this. Out of that whole Bonnie Prince Charlie whole episode, one of the things that happened was that Scotland essentially became united under the Hanoverian kings. And at that point, when the pressure was off for revolution and there wasn't the Catholic Protestant battles going on, people were free to start concentrating on education. And you had the birth of free enterprise. You had the birth of
Adam
amazing
Smith
shipping, shipping from Glasgow. That became, they were shipping, not that it's good, but they were shipping tobacco from America, and all centered in Glasgow. And it was amazing how prosperous Scotland became in and around, before the American Revolution, and then afterwards into the 1800s. They were really, in many ways, the leaders.
Well, yeah, they actually got rid of slavery before Britain did. Before
so
England.
It was amazing to me seeing that there, what a rich history they had, and how prosperous they got after they stopped fighting over the Catholic Protestant.
Right.
And they started concentrating on being a part of Britain, have the freedom then to begin to pursue these things, and they got wealthy. They were in the cotton business, they were in the tobacco business, they were going all over the world, had ships all over the world, plus then all of the, like I said, iron processes, smelting, and the bridges.
They were huge engineers.
Yeah, there's still some bridges to this day that were built during the 1800s. They're still operational in Scotland.
Yeah.
And of course in America too. But many of the people that we know are famous here that been our business leaders and science leaders.
And all sorts of leaders. John Paul Jones, American Navy. He was a Scotsman.
They all came from Scotland.
Yep. Another Rutherford quote: "A power, ethical, politic, or moral, to oppress is not from God and is not a power, but a licentious deviation of a power, and is no more from God, but from sinful nature and the old serpent." So this is that whole idea that nobody can be trusted with too much power because of the fall. Now
let's put this in perspective today. No president of the United States should be leading this country with executive orders.
Yeah.
That's a complete ruin of the American system that will last. And this started, it's been since George Bush, honestly, both sides of the aisle.
Yep.
Presidents have misused this power, in making these executive orders. Congress is of the people, is really the power. They're supposed to control the purse strings. They're supposed to actually make the laws.
Unfortunately, they can't control themselves at this point.
Oh, I know, but what I'm getting at is part of our country is sick right now based on the model that we have in the American Revolution and so forth, because you have one person, you have all the offices fighting each other, honestly. But the president's using executive orders. When you hear that about executive orders, you should say, well, it's not going to last, because that is not the way our system
It will not last.
We have to have three branches that all work together to decide. And no one branch, and we've seen the Supreme Court acting like they're God, and we've seen the president acting like he's God, and we've seen, or she, and we've seen
Congress acting like they're a pantheon of gods.
But anyway, the system of checks and balances has to be in place, or the country cannot last.
Yeah. Well, the political theorist now, a secular political theorist, part of the Scotch Enlightenment, so he wasn't really a Christian coming at this, but John Locke, he secularized the principles that he read in Lex Rex. And even though he was probably not a Christian himself, the principles fit the human condition in the real world. And that's the thing about the Bible. The human condition in the real world is fallen. There are no utopias. We can't make them. We can't make God's kingdom on earth. We learned that the hard way during the Crusades, and then some. Because the Bible fits reality in how it describes and deals with the fallen human condition. Basically, the case we have to make today is that the God of the Bible is the God of the real world. Now, Locke's secularization of these principles even influenced the Scotch Enlightenment, which rejected Christianity. And we're going to talk about David Hume and those guys in next week. But he could not resist a political ideology that was just so sensible.
Truth is truth.
Truth is truth, or at least back when people believed there was such a thing as truth. And that's going to be the problem of our day, because unfortunately for on the continent, Locke borrowed from a Reformed source, but his work did not resonate completely on the continent the way it did in Britain. Possibly for that very reason.
The 30 Years' War was going on right in.
Yeah, exactly. Why a lot of this, for all during this time, the continent was gripped by the religious wars, and we're gonna start out with those next week. These wars would have as far-reaching consequences as the Glorious Revolution, that bloodless revolution. At the very end, there was bloodless, only not in a good way. Okay, because next week we're going to be covering the religious wars, the rise of modern science on Christian faith assumptions, and the Enlightenment, Reason and Renewal, Part 1, next week. Be there. And if you're reading along in the book, chapter 18, and I promise it won't hurt.
Well, thanks for putting up with me today.
Thanks for coming in. This was great. Anyway, God bless you.
God bless you.
And thank you.